Welcome to Conversations from St. Norbert College, a program that encourages good discussion in our community on today's local and global issues. Now, your host for Conversations from St. Norbert College, author, professor, and nationally known sports economist, Dr. Kevin Quinn.
Welcome to Conversations from St. Norbert College. I'm Kevin Quinn. Our special guest is Tom Kunkel, president of St. Norbert College, and we'll discuss his new book, Man in Profile, Joseph Mitchell of the New Yorker. Tom, welcome to the program. Welcome back to the program, I guess I should say. You've been here a couple of times.
Nice
there's
to be here.
a lot of things I could ask you about, but we're going to be talking about your latest project, which is a book about Joe Mitchell.
Right.
And many of us of a certain age that are from a certain part of the country might not know who Joe Mitchell is. So can you give us a little background, and then we'll get into it a little bit more.
Yeah. Well, don't feel bad. No reason for you to know who Joe Mitchell is. But although a lot of people still do, because Joe Mitchell was one of the great nonfiction writers of all time. And many of us would also contend just one of the great American writers, period, of any kind. He was just a wonderful, wonderful writer. He was one of the great nonfiction writers for the New Yorker magazine, where most of his work appeared. And he endures for two reasons, even though he's been dead for almost 20 years, because his writing is just surpassing. I mean, it really is literature at its best. You know, he was just a wonderful writer. But the second reason, he endures is because as one of these early practitioners of what we came to call literary journalism, he was the forerunner of people like Tom Wolfe and Jimmy Breslin and Gay Talese and Joan Didion, and it goes on and on and on. It's sort of called the new journalism movement from the 60s. But it was really people like Joe Mitchell that established that you could write about real things, but your stories could be, effectively literary, could deal with the same great themes of literature. And so that's why Joe Mitchell is important. And one of the reasons I wanted to write the book was just kind of to remind everybody of why Joe Mitchell should still matter.
Well, one of the things that I think a lot of people identify with him is that he is sort of quintessential New York literary, but he didn't grow up in New York.
He did not.
He grew up in North Carolina, right?
He did. He grew up on a tobacco and cotton farm and out in the sticks in the south central part of North Carolina, almost to the South Carolina border. Definitely a farm boy, and and he loved the farm. He, all his life he kind of toggled, even though he was a product of New York City professionally, personally, and in his heart he was always a North Carolinian, and spent his whole life kind of going back and forth and feeling guilty. When he was in one, he was always thinking about the other. So he always remained very Southern. When I met him in the early '90s, I mean, even though I was in we were in his office in the New Yorker in Midtown Manhattan. He was a quintessential Southern gentleman, and when you think Southern gentleman, you can sort of see Joe's picture there. So that influenced him deeply and affected him his whole life. That notion of his Southernness was very important.
Well, for a guy that was Southern, he wound up in journalism, which is probably not, you don't think of a particularly patrician industry, and certainly going to New York. So how did he wind up as a journalist, and how did he wind up in New York City?
Well, he was the oldest. This was a fairly large farm operation that his father ran in North Carolina, and in the Southern tradition, Joe was the eldest child and certainly the eldest son. It was just assumed that he would take over the family operation. But that wasn't for him. Early on, I think he realized that his life was going to lay elsewhere. And when he went to the University of North Carolina, he fell in love with writing. On the one hand, he wrote fiction, but he also, took a lot of journalism, and he ended up writing for newspapers. So he kind of got into it that way. It's true that his father was none too pleased that he was not going to follow in his footsteps or become a doctor or some other exalted profession. But Joe said, this is what I want to do, and if you were in journalism, in the late 20s, there was only one place you wanted to be, and that was New York, which is why he went to New York and literally got there in time for the stock market crash of 1929, and there he was.
Let's talk about the New York newspaper scene. Well, let's think about New York in the late 1920s.
Right.
What did that look like, as maybe compared to now? We think about New York now as being glitzy and expensive and all that. What was New York like then?
One of Joe's dear friends and counterparts and contemporaries was another writer named Phil Hamburger. And I've got a quote in the book. He said, and Phil was talking about that very thing. He said, my gosh, he says, New York in the 20s and 30s, he said, it was so fantastic, you couldn't believe it. I mean, I think about all the great things you love about New York, and then like take out all the bad things that you hate about New York. And
Like the
that's,
Mets.
Well, that's it, and the Jets. You know, it just was this incredibly exciting place. It was emergent, you know, because after the war, you know, America's role in the war, all these people coming back to New York after the war, it had become a world city, it had become a world capital. And so this great sense of the Roaring '20s, this incredible dynamism and energy, you know, people really kind of living on life's edge, and a great youth about it. You know, the music, the energy, you know, all the media that was, you know, changing at that time. It was just an incredibly exciting place to be caught up. And so you can appreciate the magnet, you know, that it was. And there also were about a dozen newspapers. I mean, this was definitely a world of newspapers, you know, morning newspapers, afternoon newspapers, and it was just a very romantic notion, and Joe tapped right into it. I mean, he loved it.
You know, in between the newspapers, which were probably in their heyday in the 20s, you know, I don't think a lot of people know that not that long before, people couldn't afford newspapers. The average person, they were expensive. They were by subscription. But a daily paper for a penny was a fairly new invention.
Yeah.
You had the movies. You had radio.
Radio was coming
all
on.
of that stuff. I mean, really was the dawn of mass media as we have come to understand it.
That's
And it was
right.
happening in New York at that time.
And mass media magazines,
Magazines, right?
which was the venue that Mitchell eventually came to. But no, there's no question. And again, it all fueled this unbelievable sense of excitement. I mean, in a way, it's a little bit analogous to the environment we have with the emergence of the digital age, and the sense that everything's possible. All the rules have changed. A smart young person that has a good idea and is willing to take a chance can get rich in a hurry. All these things, were happening, in the 1920s, and and Joe loved it. I mean, he got on within a couple weeks, despite the advent of the Depression. He had gotten on a job as a newspaper reporter, and he spent the better part of the next 10 years doing that, and he loved it.
With the Herald Tribune, right, is where he wound up.
He started with the Herald Tribune, which he worked at for several years, at a time when, other than the New York Times, the Herald Tribune, clearly the best, the highest quality paper. And a lot of people felt like it had the best quality writing. For Joe Mitchell, it was definitely like going to journalism school. Mm-hmm. And then he ultimately went over to the World Telegram, where he spent the next 7 or 8 years as one of their feature reporters. And the other great thing about New York is anybody who was anybody, was coming through there. So every celebrity, whether they were coming from Europe or coming from the West and going to Europe, or they were all coming through New York, and Joe wrote about almost all of them. And so he was profiling. One day he's profiling, George Bernard Shaw, and the next day he's writing about Harpo Marx, and it's, and he. I say in the book, it's hard to imagine anybody that sort of saw more of 20s and 30s New York, or 30s New York, than Joseph Mitchell, because of the catbird seat he had on just kind of watching the parade go by.
That had to be something to see. But, of course, when you're in the middle of it, you don't necessarily realize that you're in the middle of something incredibly special. Now, he wound up at the New Yorker, but so... most of us know the New Yorker, I think, as cartoons that are supposed to be funny
right.
if we want to impress people. But talk a little bit about where the New Yorker came from. I mean, it's been around now for going to be 90 years or something like that. That's a long time.
Yeah, they're having their 90th anniversary. Well, they just had their 90th anniversary. Yes, it's a very long time for a magazine. There's a few magazines in this country that are older, but no magazine has had more influence, I would say, on American literature and letters than the New Yorker. It was founded in 1925 by a guy, a high school dropout, a rube named Harold Ross. Now, I love him. He was actually the subject of the first book I ever wrote, which through a daisy chain of events led me to do the Joe Mitchell project. But Harold Ross had gone to war with the Americans, had gone to France, helped start the Stars and Stripes newspaper during World War I. And after the war, like so many people, he came back to New York to kind of make his fortune. And he cooked up the idea of the New Yorker, even though he was about as sophisticated as a saddle. He had this notion that that you could target a high-end, a very discerning audience that advertisers would want. I mean, this is all really new thinking. I mean, it's kind of the print equivalent of like Facebook in terms of a big idea. And and it almost crashed and burned a couple times, but he finally caught on and it worked. And very quickly it became this incredibly influential publication, both because it was a place where exciting new writers were found in terms of fiction. John O'Hara, for instance, was one of the first big fiction writers at the New Yorker, but for nonfiction. Today we've known the New Yorker is important for its reporting from all over the world, but really it was in the 30s when people like Joe Mitchell came and were writing nonfiction in a way that was very readable and very literate, and that was another innovation that Ross, and the New Yorker brought about. So there's so many reasons why the New Yorker is today still considered so influential, in American letters and American media. And Joe Mitchell was one of the people that made the New Yorker as popular as it was.
Well, obviously the influence is still there, because I have a list here of about 20 or 25 well-known publications that have reviewed your book. Oh. I think you have more here that have reviewed your book than have people who've bought any of my books. So that's pretty impressive.
Well, I don't know if I have as many people as bought mine either, but somebody's paying attention, which is nice.
So most of what we know about him is what he did for the New Yorker and the features that he wrote. So talk about what he profiled. What kind of nonfiction did he write?
Well, that was the other thing. I mean, that Joe was really a groundbreaker. Because remember, this publication, as I said, was cast toward the high end. The advertisers were, Saks and Tiffany's and the fur dealers and the cruise lines. And,
well, think of the iconic first cover of
absolutely
with the monocle.
Eustace
and
Tilley, yeah, absolutely. So that was the audience. So suddenly here comes Joe Mitchell, and he's writing about a woman that runs a movie house in the Bowery. And after hours helps bums in the street and passes out dimes. Right. He's writing about this homeless guy who's probably half insane, who's this gadfly in Greenwich Village, who's compiling an oral history of our time. He's writing about people that nobody else is paying. Not only they're not writing about, they're not even paying attention to. And he writes about Lady Olga, the bearded lady in the circus. But he writes about them with great dignity. I mean, he's not writing about them as freaks. He's not writing about them to make fun of them. He's not smirking at them or being snarky. He's writing about them with great empathy. He's writing about them as human beings who just happen to, be the bearded lady in the circus. The bearded lady in the circus, all she ever really wanted to be was a court stenographer. I mean, that's part of the point of, that story, that they're really like you and me, but for the fact that, they've got this thing going on with them. And it was just remarkable, and people loved it. But it wasn't just that he did it, it was the way he did it with just great style, great wit, great warmth, tremendous empathy, and which he did his entire life. One of my favorite stories of all that Joe ever wrote, he wrote in the 50s, was called Mr. Hunter's Grave, about an elderly African-American gentleman who tended to this cemetery in this fading, decrepit little town in Staten Island. And, you can read that story in a half an hour, and it covers all the themes that Shakespeare covered, and it covers the themes that Joyce covered, and it covers the themes that Oedipus covered, and it's all there in this true life story, and it's literature, and that's why Joe Mitchell's work endures to this day, because he's dealing with these great themes. They just happen to be about actual people.
Sort of. We'll get to that in a minute.
Mostly.
Mostly. Well, as I was kind of reading your book and thinking about this, so he wrote about the Bowery and the waterfront, etc., at a time when actually the Bowery Boys movies were popular Saturday afternoon matinee fare that the Three Stooges, who were sort of that, I'm not sure if they were from the Bowery, but they were part of that world. The outside looking in, which is a fairly populist way to think about things in the 1930s, right?
Sure.
I mean, most people probably felt like they were on the outside looking in.
I'm sure that's a good point.
So I want to ask you about a couple of different locations, and I'll ask you about people.
Sure.
So Sloppy Louie's.
Right. Sloppy Louie's was this wonderful seafood restaurant near the Fulton Fish Market, not far from the Brooklyn Bridge in Manhattan. And it was one of the Fish Market and Sloppy Louie's were two of Joe's great haunts. I mean, he spent a lot of time. He knew tons of people, at these places. And Louis Marino, an Italian immigrant, was the owner of Sloppy Louie's, and it just, again, it was a definite part of New York in microcosm. Very colorful place and a very colorful person.
And another place that you write about, in fact, you open your book about this, is Mcsorley's Bar.
Mcsorley's.
Now, most of us know Mcsorley as the guy that played hockey, but this is a different Mcsorley, right?
Different Mcsorley. Mcsorley's Old Ale House on 7th Avenue, or 7th Street in New York, in Greenwich Village, continues to this day. It's the oldest continuously operating saloon in New York City. And they basically just sell ale and a pretty good hamburger, I will add. That's been a recent addition. But, and again, Mcsorley's, Joe memorialized Mcsorley's when he wrote about it. I think it was around 1940 or 41 or 39. But when he wrote about it, he wrote about how it essentially was frozen in time from 1870s. And if you go today, it's absolutely still frozen in time. It just, the whole place is full of portraits of long dead Irish politicians and firefighters and boxers, and there's still a stove, in the middle of the tavern, and they still put sawdust on the floor, and the bar still looks like a swayback horse. And it's just a great slice of New York. And Kevin, if you've never been, that's got to be on your bucket list.
That sounds like a place I'd find a natural habitat for me.
You spent a lovely afternoon. Trust me.
But he liked it because it was a throwback, and he could observe the characters that were coming in and out, because in a sense they were throwbacks too, right? He went there long after he was no longer prolific as a writer.
He did. Well, he went there for a number of reasons. One is he lived in the village, and so it was only a few blocks from his house. But he loved it in particular. I mean, he loved it in the beginning just because the same reason you'll love it when you go, and I love it when I go to New York. It's a cool place. And it was probably full of really even more interesting old characters, when Joe went there. The reason he kept going to it later, long after he wrote about it, though, was because it was a haven for him. Joe, as New York changed in the 60s and 70s, and it wasn't changing for the better, this depressed Joe terribly, and he was prone to depression anyway. And so he was looking for things to kind of latch on to the past that was not fading away, because everything else was fading away. And this was very distressing to him. And the one thing in New York that wasn't going anywhere in any way, shape, or form was Mcsorley's. So he found it a real oasis. And he would go there, especially when he was just not feeling great. It was guaranteed to cheer him up, as it will you.
Well, I have heard tell, there are many taverns throughout Wisconsin that when you walk in, you could be in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, et cetera. So it was probably one of those kinds of places.
Absolutely.
I have to ask you about some of these characters,
Sure.
because they are just wild. So let's start with Joe Gould, Professor Seagull.
Right. Well, so this was a guy I mentioned earlier. He was a Harvard graduate, brilliant.
An actual Harvard grad,
actual Harvard graduate. But of course, he clearly had emotional illnesses and schizophrenia. I'm not sure, but there's no question that today, I mean, he probably would have gotten help. But at the time, he was homeless, toothless, a vagrant. You could smell him coming long before you saw him. Flea-ridden, and he just haunted, these parts of Greenwich Village, and he begged and bummed and coaxed people, for money, and that's how he sort of survived. But he was not just a regular homeless person, because he said that he had grown up being able to communicate with seagulls, and so he'd break into this these screeches. He would dance kind of on one leg, you know, with his wings extended, like he was doing the seagull dance, and he would screech and caw and speak seagull. But the thing that interested Joe Mitchell about him is that Joe Gould said he was compiling an oral history of our time. So in other words, every conversation that he's encountering in New York, as you can imagine, he's like logging this, you know, in a handwritten book that was up to like 9 million words or something. So that was kind of the hook for Joe, you know, to write it. That took him from just being a kind of interesting oddball to somebody worth writing about.
And I mean, this guy Joe Gould actually wound up with a benefactor that was paying for his his life for a long time, based on this book that never really existed. Right?
Yeah, well, Joe Mitchell, when he wrote about him, he basically, you know, elevated Joe Gould from just this village eccentric to, you know, a real New York character. And yeah, I mean, people kind of gave him money but he still died penniless, homeless, and in an insane asylum. And I mean, it was very sad, but...
Doing a seagull impression apparently is how he perished. This is the story, I guess.
Maybe. But interestingly, Joe Mitchell came back to Joe Gould and did a kind of a sequel in 1964 because he sort of tells the rest of the story, if you will. But that was the last piece that he ever published. It was from that point that for the next 30 years, Joe continued to go to the New Yorker, but he didn't publish anything. So Joe Gould's Secret is literally the last piece Joe Mitchell published.
And yet, you know, and this is 50 years later or more, and I mean, the amount of attention that your book has drawn obviously says that he still is a relevant character.
Well, he's definitely relevant to a lot of people. I mean, you ask a lot of top journalists to this day, you know, who their influences were, and many of them will tell you that Joe Mitchell is at the top of the list.
I want to ask you about another character that Mitchell wrote about, Hugh Flood, Old Man Hugh Flood.
Right.
Tell us about Hugh.
Well, Hugh Flood, they sort of called him the mayor of the Fulton Fish Market, and he was in his 90s, and he said that when Joe wrote about him, and he said that his goal was he wanted to live to be 115. And one of the interesting ways he went about it is the only thing he ate was seafood. He called himself a seafooditarian. And he did eat the occasional onion, and he would eat the occasional piece of bread, but basically everything else he ate was seafood. And Joe Mitchell wrote a 3-part profile, basically, of old Mr. Flood over the span of a year or so. And it turned out after the fact, and Joe acknowledged after the fact that Hugh Flood didn't exist. He was a composite figure that Joe cobbled together from 3 or 4 people, elder gentlemen from the market that did exist, but none of whom wanted to be written about.
And that actually, I think, comes to one of the most interesting contributions that you've made, is that he acknowledged this, but he did not acknowledge that maybe some of these other folks that he had written about, the King of the Gypsies and some of these other folks, maybe weren't as existing as he laid out.
That's right, yeah. So he did, in fact, acknowledge, he wrote about Mr. Flood in the mid-40s, and then in 48 he came out with a book version of it, and he said in the book this was a composite. But so people knew that, but what they didn't know is it turned out that another one of his famous subjects, a guy named Cockeye Johnny Nickenoff, the king of the gypsy community in New York, was also a composite. No one ever knew that. I learned that because in his files, Joe left a long letter to the attorney at the New Yorker, many years later after he wrote the story, saying, I made this guy up, he's a composite, Harold Ross, the editor, and I talked about how we could do this story. Nobody knew that until, my book was published. And there was one other gentleman in another story that was either a composite or as a pseudonym, but as an individual, as an actual human being, he didn't exist either. I think, as far as I can tell, those are the only 3 instances. Those happened within about a 5-year period, those 3 stories. And I think that's the only time Joe ever did it. I never really expressed remorse, but he did stop doing it, and I think he probably, there's evidence to suggest that I think he felt like in pushing this envelope about what was allowable, for a nonfiction writer, they probably pushed too far, and so he never did that again. But he did use a lot of latitude with some other, techniques that, still were subject to question.
Well, one of the very favorable reviews of the book was written in the Columbia Journalism Review.
Yeah.
And the title was, "I wish you hadn't written this book," or
I wish this guy hadn't written this book.
hadn't written
Right.
this book.
Yeah.
And then he proceeds to talk about, why it is that he
Yeah.
did. But let's talk about the way that you went about doing the research for this.
Right.
Okay. I mean, you did a lot of original research and going through original papers.
Oh yeah.
Right?
Well, I was very fortunate. Joe. By the time I started this around 2001 and 2002, and Joe had been dead 5 or 6 years by then. And so I was dealing with his executor, and she authorized it. But Joe was a pack rat, and so I knew that somewhere in Midtown Manhattan there was a storage locker that was just chock full of boxes of stuff. Didn't know what was in the stuff. His executor didn't really know exactly what was in the stuff either, and she just hadn't had. She'd been emotionally involved with him. There were just a lot of reasons she never really got into it, and so it took me like 2 years just to persuade her. Let's start getting into it and see what we've got. So over the process of the next 3 or 4 years, I'd go up to New York, every couple of months, spend a few days. We'd go to the storage facility. We'd get 4 or 5 boxes. We'd take them back to her apartment. We'd sit in the living room and start going through boxes and seeing what we had. And, and a lot of it was sort of, I call journal material. He kind of kept the, irregular journal, for a number of years. A lot of it was hand scrawl, some of it was typed, and then he'd go for months and he wouldn't, and then he'd pick it back up. A lot of it was correspondence. A lot of it was just stuff he clipped out of the papers and magazines or things that interested him. He was very eclectic. Everything interested him. So like he had boxes and boxes of the Gypsy Lore Society Journal, because he was a member of the Gypsy Lore Society. He collected everything. He collected bricks. He collected pickle forks from hotels. He collected arrowheads. He collected plow tips from his farm in North Carolina. He collected those colored glass insulators at the top of telephone poles. Those of us of a certain age will remember. He collected everything. Everything interested him. And so he just had unbelievable amount of stuff, most of which didn't, have a lot of bearing on the biography, but what did was incredibly important, because it was kind of like tapping straight into the guy's psyche. He's writing what he thinks, and I may be the first person that's seen it, and maybe the only person that's seen it since he wrote it. So even though he wasn't there to interview, in a sense, I knew a lot about what he thought about a lot of things. It was very privileged, in that sense.
So how long did it take you to get through all this stuff?
The culling, a good 4 years, I would say.
4 years.
And again, it wasn't 4 years solid, but this is just I had an actual job, as I do now, and so it was just, when I could cadge a long weekend or something, or a vacation week, I'd go up to New York and do what I could, and I did it, with his executor. Sort of going through this together. So it was tedious in the extreme. Really interesting, but tedious.
So now that this project is done, are you kind of eyeing another? Is there something that you got in your eye, or?
Well, most of the time, I think if you talk to people that have written books, they've always got a couple at least that they kind of moving on deck. I think about some things, but I'm not in any real hurry. I want to say St. Norbert College has been great in terms of being understanding and helping me clear a little time and space to do this, but I need to reciprocate a little bit, and not that I think I've been, not on the job or anything, but it wouldn't really be fair to plunge into another book for a while, and I need a break anyway.
Yeah, the scars after a book need to heal.
A lot of bandages.
Yeah, I heard once a book is never really finished, merely abandoned, and I think there's some truth to that. Well, if you haven't gotten a chance to take a look at this book yet, it's a great book, and even if you don't know anything about Joe Mitchell, which is how I came to this, it's really worth a read. So until next time, I hope you've enjoyed our conversation as much as I have. Best wishes for good conversations from St. Norbert College.